I can be.
Can you hear us now, folks out there? Somebody answer in the
I'll have to wait a couple seconds. See if you know, the stream is runs about what 10 to 20 seconds behind.
Mm-hmm. Can you hear us? Testing 1 2 5 7 9. Marcia says thanks.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, we're on now. We're good.
Hey, hi everybody. This is Alex from the Astro Imaging channel, and I'm going to tell you a few things about what's happening in the very near future. Tonight, Tom is going to be telling us about some stuff from the Stellafane Schupmann telescope and some of the images he gets from it. He's going to be coming back in a little while and tell us about some of the lucky imaging techniques he's going to be using. NEAF is coming up, so be sure to get signed up for both NEAC, the Astro Imaging Conference, where Tim will be presenting there. And then next week, we have a special show with Jim Thompson. Jim Thompson's going to be telling us a little bit about filters. As a matter of fact, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to invite Jim to come on in and tell us a little bit about what he's talking about next week.
All right,
Jim, you want to take it?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. So my plan for next week is to give everybody an overview of basically everything you want to know about astronomical filters, starting at the very beginning with what are they and how to use them, how to pick the right filter for your application. And then for the latter part of the presentation, I'll talk about some more advanced topics, including using filters with fast optics, the arms race for the best multi-narrowband filter, how narrow a filter is too narrow, and what's going on with star halos. So that's all coming next Sunday. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, let's see, I've got to go back to Sharon for a bit here. Don't forget over here, you can on the YouTube screen, you can make all your comments and ask any questions. We'll hold your questions for Tom until we get to convenient places to ask him. So if you've got anything about what he's saying, go ahead and ask him right over here. We've got 42 watching right now, and I think we're about ready to go. So I am going to stop sharing and ask Tom to start his sharing. And tell us what you're going to be, or tell us what you have to say, Tom.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, just getting set up here. Can we see this? You see the screen?
Yep.
Looks good.
And can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I guess we're ready to go. So thanks for inviting me. So tonight we'll be talking about the latest lucky imaging results using the 13-inch Schupmann telescope at Stellafane and the 6-inch Warner and Swasey refractor, and also a few other telescopes. And yes, I will be at Northeast Astronomy Forum. Stellafane has a booth, and I'll be there all of both days. Here's a brief outline. Very briefly, we'll talk about what is Stellafane for those who may not be familiar. What is a Schupmann telescope, and why do we want to use a Schupmann telescope? Some recent improvements to the Schupmann we've made. We'll very briefly talk about the 6-inch Warner and Swasey refractor at Mount Wilson. We'll very briefly go over the lucky imaging technique. It's not a how-to. There's just not enough time for that in one session. But I will be going over some details in the next month about imaging the moon. And then we'll show some latest results, introduce the high dynamic range imaging, and then talk about some ancillary results. Okay, so briefly, what is Stellafane? Strictly speaking, Stellafane means Shrine to the Stars, and it's the clubhouse of the Springfield telescope makers. Also, over the years, it has become to be known as the name for the annual Stellafane convention, telescope making convention that occurs every year in Springfield, Vermont, for the last almost 100 years. And here's a picture of our pink clubhouse on the right, and that structure on the left in the upper picture is actually the Russell Porter turret telescope. So the whole building is an actual telescope, and the observer observes from the inside, but the details of that could be left to another talk, perhaps. And this is just a picture of the convention. People set up their homemade telescopes for judging, and people spend a nice weekend. Hopefully we have some nice weather. And this was all started by Russell Porter 100 years ago. If you're interested in studying up on Porter, you can buy Bert Willards, who's our most senior club member. He wrote a biography of Porter about 50 years ago, and that's a picture of Porter polishing a mirror. And we're in the midst of a series of 100-year anniversaries. The first telescope making class put on by Porter was August 17th, 1920. And this coming December 7th will be the 100th anniversary of the official founding of our club. And this here up in the upper left is a picture of the first telescope making class. Also, Russell Porter is famously known for his drawings of the 100-inch telescope, his famous cutaway drawings, and the other designs that George Hale hired him to do. And history is very important to Stellafane. You can see these two side-by-side pictures, one in 1954 and one in 2015. And except for the colorization of the modern picture, they're essentially the same. We try to keep things, doing things the old ways. So now we'll talk briefly about, anybody have any questions, and can you hear me?
Yep, sounding good.
Okay. I'll check in from time to time to make sure the connection is okay. So we'll talk briefly about a Schupmann telescope. Schupmann telescope was invented by Ludwig Schumann about 150 years ago in Germany, and it has gone through a variety of evolutionary steps. And most of the recent, as in the last 40 or 50 year improvements, have been by James Daly. He's a very senior member of the Springfield Telescope Makers. And this is a picture of Jim on the left with a primary objective mirror that he made. And he wrote a book about the history and the development and the designs of the Schupmann, if one is interested in the great details. And that book is still available. So if you're really interested in the grimy details, it's best to study this book. But the reason we want to use a Schupmann telescope is we have to keep in mind what our goals are. The primary targets for the Schupmann is it's not a wide field, rich field telescope. It's somewhat high magnification, small field of view. So it's good for the planets. It's good for small star fields. It's good for the moon. But when we're trying to take images, we have to keep in mind that our goal is to capture the most subtle details on our target as possible. And for that, we want good quality optics, and we want to keep diffraction and scattering to a minimum. And this telescope will allow us to do that. So this is a somewhat older picture of the tube. It's currently been repainted, but we have a 13-inch primary objective, single lens on the sky side. That lens then makes a focus down here on a 2.5-inch field mirror, and this field mirror is not a flat; it has curvature, and this curve re-images the primary objective on a corrector mirror. And we'll talk about this mirror in a little bit more detail as we go on. It's also called a Mangan mirror, or it could also just be referred to as a corrector. And the idea is that because this is a single lens, it puts a lot of chromatic aberration in the image. Well, the idea is that this corrector removes all of that chromatic aberration, and then it goes to a standard Newtonian focus, and then we could put our eyepiece or our camera. So this is the basic optical alignment. And this is a list of some of the advantages. It's a perfectly achromatic refractor. So it doesn't just have low color, it has zero color. It has no central obstruction, so we have no diffraction from that. We can correct for atmospheric dispersion. Right now, for example, Saturn is very low on the horizon, and as light passes through the atmosphere, the light splits the colors up, and it creates a chromatic aberration in the image. Well, this corrector can not only correct for the chromatic aberration put in by the primary objective, it also can correct for the atmosphere. The Mangan corrector is a back surface mirror, which again we'll get into in a little more detail, and back surface reflections have less scatter than front surface reflections. Also, the reflective mirrors are smaller than what would be for a full aperture telescope, and the less surface area you have, the less scattering you have. Also, these, even though there are more of them, more optical surfaces to work on, in general, one at a time, they're easier to make. One reason being they're all spherical. So this is the basics of a Schupmann telescope. And again, back to the chromatic aberration, the main primary objective is a single lens, and we know that a single lens creates a lot of chromatic aberration because the blue, the green, and the red light all focus at different distances. So you can never get a really good image. Over here on the right, we have a plot where the x-axis is the wavelength and the y-axis is the focal length. So the focus for each of the colors of light from this lens falls along this blue line. So you can't get a common focus for any combination of colors. So this lens will produce a very poor image. So one solution that was found by opticians hundreds of years ago was to add a second lens. And we see that we now have a better focus. And on our plot of wavelength versus focal length, we're now on this yellow line. And we see that over the course of visible light from 400 to 700 nanometers, we're now getting better at our focal length, but it's still only two colors are really of the same focal length, and we're still going to get some degradation. We could also add a third lens, and it does even better. We're now on this red line, but it's still not perfect, as opposed to this black line, which is the Schupmann telescope, which shows that the focal length for all of the colors across the visible spectrum are the same. So we can get a perfectly corrected color image. And this is accomplished. This schematic shows how this is accomplished. This is taken from Jim Daly's text. Here's our primary objective, single lens, which creates a lot of chromatic aberration. The blue focus and the red focus are very far apart, and all of the subsequent colors focus in between. This is kind of the second half of the telescope where we have this corrector, also called the Mangan mirror. And in this particular mirror, both the front surface and the back surface are ground and polished and figured, and the back surface is where the aluminum or silver coating is applied. So if we do in our test, we do a white light point source, shine it onto this mirror. The light actually goes through the glass, bounces off the back, and comes back out, and we will have a lot of chromatic aberration. However, we notice it's in the exact opposite direction as that for the primary. So if you can imagine bringing this second piece of the telescope, move it up where the blue and the red match, what comes in as white light from the stars comes out. This is where we would put our eyepiece or our camera, comes out as perfect white light. And this is another schematic of the whole telescope in one piece. Again, we have white light coming in, the single primary. It comes to a focus on this field mirror, very bad chromatic aberration. This field mirror re-images the objective onto this corrector with the back surface silvered, and what comes out is nice white light, which we put our camera or our eyepiece. Any questions on this so far?
Not so far. You're all set.
I've got one.
Sure.
How good is the collimation on this thing? Because it seems to me it would have to be absolutely perfect to get rid of all the colors.
Okay. One part that I was going to get into later, but I can talk about now is
That's okay. If you've got it, bringing it up later, that's fine.
okay.
Yeah.
Hey,
Okay.
Tom,
Yes.
do you have to make adjustments on that like you do for a typical ADC when you're shooting, planets that are low? You typically adjust an ADC to bring the red and blue into the center. Do you have to do the same thing here?
We're going to get into that shortly.
Awesome. Sorry.
Sure, that's okay. At least I know people can hear me. Okay, so now we have a nice color-free telescope, but there are other degradations that we want to minimize. And this is a picture of a simple Newtonian telescope at the Stellafane convention, and we all know that Newtonians have the secondary mirror that's in the light path, and that creates diffraction. So here on the upper right is a simulation of a star with no secondary, and then the bottom is a simulation of a telescope with a secondary, and we see that the secondary puts a lot more light in these outer rings, and that will reduce the contrast of our image and degrade or reduce the amount of the low contrast detail, which is the whole goal of why we're trying to take an image. So just like any refractor, the Schupmann does not have this problem. Okay, now is when we're going to talk about getting rid of the color from the atmosphere. So here on the left is an example. Saturn is low in the horizon. As the light is coming through at this high angle, the atmosphere splits the colors, and we see some chromatic aberration. This is obviously this is an exaggeration, but what we would see is a blue tinge at the top of Saturn and a red tinge at the bottom. What's not shown in this specific diagram is this field mirror is mounted on an XY platform where the knobs are literally sticking out of the back of the telescope. So we can adjust the tip and tilt of this mirror. And that determines the amount of correction that is, the amount of color that is removed from the the image with chromatic aberration. So strictly speaking, in real time, we can adjust these knobs to remove the color from the image. And we often do this if we're changing targets which have a great difference in altitude. So if you're going from, say, Saturn, which may be 30 degrees on the horizon in the summer, and you want to look at, say, the double-double, which will be near the zenith, we can see that there will be color introduced into that image as we go from low horizon to high in the sky. And in real time, we can adjust the tip and tilt very slightly. They're 2 micrometers, which have knobs that stick out the back of the telescope, and we can adjust this color. So the point being is we not only can use this adjustment to correct for atmospheric, but we also can adjust for any slight degradation and collimation of the image because of, for instance, telescope sag or such. So the point is that the second part of the telescope, the corrector part, it doesn't know, or it also doesn't really care where the color comes from or the reason for it. We can tune it out. Does that answer those 2 questions?
Perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. Another reason we'd like to have a Schupmann is scattering. All reflections scatter light, and back surface coated mirrors scatter less than front surface. Also, the total surface area of the coated mirrors in a Schupmann is about 1/2 of that of the equivalent, for example, Newtonian that was a 13-inch diameter. So the surface area of the Mangan, which is the corrector, plus the field mirror, plus the fold mirror, which is just your Newtonian right angle mirror, is about 1/2 the surface area of the objective. So the Schupmann has about 1/2 the scatter from its mirrors than a Newtonian of equivalent aperture. Also, the lenses in general on a 1-by-1 basis are easier to make because they're smaller, they're spherical, and they have greatly reduced wedge sensitivity. So even though overall a Schupmann is a little bit complicated to make, the pieces by themselves are relatively easy. Because, for example, when you're making a doublet or a triplet refractor, those surfaces not only have to be perfect or near perfect by themselves, but they have to be very high quality within reference to all of the other surfaces. And that gets to be a multiplying difficulty. So this is the scope we end up with. And this is a painting on the side of the wall, which is shown here in the lower right of our observatory, done by one of our members, Russ Camella, who's since passed away. But he did this in the thinking of Russell Porter's diagrams of the 200-inch telescope at Palomar, these cutaway drawings. So here we have our 13-inch primary, a single objective, which creates an image on the 2.5-inch field mirror, which has a curve, which re-images the objective onto the Mangan corrector, which corrects all of the chromatic aberration, and what comes off is nice white light, which we can put to our eyepiece or our camera. Now, this isn't exactly an improvement, but one thing you have to make sure, of course, is that your optics are nice and clean, because dust and dirt and grit on your optics will do the same, will cause scattering, and will also reduce the very subtle features, and will prevent you from getting a high contrast image. So here's Jim Daly cleaning the front surface of our 13-inch lens. And even though most people think that cleaning optics may be a bit of a dark art, especially when it comes to lenses with hard glass, it's really not that difficult. He's literally using Windex and Bounty paper towels. You just have to, of course, be a little bit careful, but you always do want to make sure your optics are clean. And there's our nice clean lens. And we do this on the order of about once a year, basically in the spring. Another improvement we recently made is this original Mangan corrector was coated about 1995. And this is the front surface of the Mangan. This is the back surface, and you see that it's painted black, and it's painted to protect the silver coating. But even though it's painted, over time, the fluctuations in temperature and the humidity eventually dig their way in underneath this black coating, and the silver coating was starting to degrade. So we had that recoated a few years ago. And here's Jim Daly reinstalling it in its mirror holder. And this is our tilt adjustments for that Mangan corrector. And of course, once you reinstall or take out and reinstall any mirror, you have to make sure that everything is aligned properly. So this is a picture inside the focusing box. So this is the corrector of the field mirror. And right now there's a cover over it to keep dust off. And on that cover, we have a little target sight. So we shoot a laser into the eyepiece holder, and we want to make sure that the laser, as we see here on the right, comes back to the center, and that shows that everything is in proper alignment. So a recent big improvement we made is the installation of a Leo stop. Now, right now I'm showing a video of Saturn, which is fluctuating. So as amateurs readily observe, when we observe the planets, especially at high power, of course, they're not stable. They're constantly fluctuating and moving around a little bit. And of course, this is what we call seeing. And our Leo stop is, we installed it to try to help us beat this problem. So why do we want a Leo stop? And we're not going to go over this in super detail. I have these papers if anyone is interested. But this physicist, David Fried, back in the 50s and 60s, he studied the physics of the atmosphere. And what he found that the atmosphere, of course, it's not homogeneous. It has different areas of pressure and temperature, humidity, etc. But but in a fine sense, it is made up of these cells, and each of these cells inside it is actually homogeneous. And what happens is as these cells move across our field of view, they act like lenses that are moving in front of the field of view. And the smaller these cells are, the more of these lenses pass in our field of view, and that's what causes the poor seeing that we see. And amateurs have seen this for a long time, and we know that on nights of bad seeing, we know that a smaller telescope will provide a more stable view than a larger telescope. And that's because a smaller telescope is looking through fewer of these cells. And this was all studied by this physicist, Fried. And this equation was worked out where the probability of getting a good image, defined as a good image being of a very short exposure, and that the term is called freezing the seeing, the probability of getting a, quote, good image is related to this equation. Now, we don't need to go over this equation too much, except we have to look at these two parameters, capital D and R0, and the fact that this is a negative exponent. Capital D is the aperture of your telescope. So this shows, because it's a negative exponent, that as D increases, P will decrease. So this is a mathematical way of showing that a larger telescope will have a less chance of getting a good image of a planet. R0 is called the Fried parameter, and it's the size of these atmospheric cells that are passing in front. And because this is a negative exponent and this is a divisor, the larger R0 is, meaning the bigger these cells are, the higher probability. So while at any given moment we may not be able to control the atmosphere we're looking through, we can control the size of our telescope. This was a plot made by Cliff Ashcraft, and it's a plot of that equation for different apertures of telescopes. And in this particular case, the x-axis is the R0 parameter, where the left side is small size cells, or, quote, bad seeing, and the right side is large cells, which is good seeing. And the y-axis is the number of frames you have to take in order to get a, quote, good image. So, for example, if you have a 12.5-inch telescope on this particular night of seeing, you might have to take 2,000 images just to get one good image. But if you change to an 8-inch telescope, we go down the line to this green line, we now only have to take 10. So this shows that decreasing the aperture of your telescope increases the probability of getting a nice stable image. Of course, we have to pay the penalty that we have less resolution, but there's really no point in getting a high resolution of a blurry planet. And so the reason we install the Leo stop is it enables us to very quickly and easily convert our 13-inch telescope into a 9-inch telescope. So we installed the Leo stop in front of our corrector. So here's Jim Daly installing the Leo stop. On the left side, we see that the Leo stop is this plate with this hole in the center. And when this plate is in the optical path, it makes an equivalent 9-inch telescope. And when the plate is flipped up out of the path, as we see here on the right, we have our full aperture 13-inch telescope. And we wanted to do this in keeping with kind of the old ways. We didn't want to have motors and computers and such. So we did it in a mechanical way like Porter might have done. So here's Jim Daly. We basically just have a long rod with a push-pull action. And here's Jim Daly drilling some holes and installing the rod. And here's our little knob that we have sticking out of the telescope. So as we push and pull this knob, we can, as we see here on the right, the two cases have the Leo stop out of the telescope and out of the optical axis or out of the optical path for a 13-inch and in the optical path for a 9-inch. So we can very easily convert to a smaller telescope on nights of bad seeing. So do we have any questions on the Schupmann telescope?
I have a question. So how do you assess the seeing? Is it just visual, or do you have some device set up where you look at the seeing and then make the adjustment with the stop?
It is purely visual. Actually, the eye is very good at making that determination. Just with a little bit of practice, you can see very quickly whether you have good seeing or not, especially once you're experienced with any particular telescope. You know if you're seeing the detail you should. And because it's so easy, it literally takes a few seconds to do. There's really no penalty. You can try it with or without the stop in and see what happens. But it is all visual. The eye is very good at making that determination.
Tom, how long ago was the Schupmann originally built?
It was originally built in 1995.
Okay. Thank you. That's it, right, Eric? Time to go on with the presentation.
Yeah, I don't see anything from YouTube.
Okay, so this is a picture of the 6-inch Warner and Swasey refractor at Mount Wilson, which is another telescope I use from time to time. This is one of the early telescopes, nighttime telescopes, that was installed at Mount Wilson. It's been there since about 1910 or so. It was there for many years, and then sometime, perhaps in the 80s or 90s, it was removed. It was put in storage in the Snow telescope, and a Meade was installed in its place. And then several years ago, John Briggs found it in a crate in the Snow telescope, and he convinced the Mount Wilson higher-ups that he should be allowed to reinstall it in its original location. So he did, and it's pretty much as it was 110 years ago. One second. It has its original weight-driven mount, which is a close-up shown here on the right. It's all original, and it works. It's not necessarily the best clock drive in the world, but it generally works. And it has the original 100-volt DC motor, which automatically raises the weight, which is in the pedestal. So it's pretty much all original. It does, of course, have a modern eyepiece, and we put a modern electronic camera on it. But other than that, it's all original. It does have a very strange lens, which we'll get to shortly. Its original lens, it does cause some problems. It's a bit of a strange design, but it's general a very nice telescope, 6-inch f/15. Brashear made the lens, so it's of very high quality. And it's good to see what the old telescope can do. So now we'll just talk about briefly what is lucky imaging. So lucky imaging is the process of capturing and saving many short exposures as rapidly as possible and selecting the quote good images to be aligned, averaged, and enhanced in post-processing. And that's the whole point of this, is to try to beat this bad seeing that we saw previously and we'll see again shortly in that blurry image of Saturn and that live image when we're looking through our telescopes at any planet at high power. And these are the general steps for lucky imaging. We capture the raw images, we pre-align them if necessary, we select the good images, align them and average them, we wavelet process them to get the best detail out of them, and then we do whatever other post-processing is necessary. And this last point, which I've added recently, is practice, practice, practice. Because what I find over the years is, even though you might think that this procedure is relatively scientific, there is a lot of art and experience that is required. I noticed that as time goes on, my results get better and better, even though I can't attribute what I'm doing differently. So it must be that there's subtle differences in what I'm doing, decisions I'm making, etc., that have just come from years of practice. So practice is important, and you will get better over time. So again, remember that our starting point is this blurry image of Saturn or Jupiter or whatever other planet you might be looking at. And again, this is the result of these cells of air, of homogeneous air, that are acting like lenses as they are drifting in between your telescope and your target. So first we need a fast readout camera. I tend to use the ZWO cameras. These aren't the only cameras available. There are others. In general, nowadays, these cameras, for what they can do, they're pretty a reasonable price. If you're going to use, if you're taking a picture of a planet only, you might as well get a camera with a small chip, because large chips are expensive. So you can get a chip that's well big enough for the planets for on the order of $150 or $180. And these cameras will provide dozens or hundreds of frames per second. And in my opinion, that's a pretty good price for that capability. If you're going to be shooting the moon, or which also we can do lucky imaging on, you would need a larger chip, or it would take you a very long time to image a large piece of the moon. Of course, larger chips with cameras with larger chips cost more money, but even on the order of $1,000 or $1,200, that's still not too bad for what this camera can do. And you're also probably going to need a filter wheel with the appropriate, at least red, green, and blue filters. So the first step is to capture the raw images. I happen to use Fire Capture. This is not the only program, but it's just the one I use. And as with many of the programs we see that we can use, there's a community, and there's someone in Europe writes this program and makes it available for free. And it's very powerful. You can select, you'll either take the entire chip or select your region of interest. You can select your gain, your exposure. You can input the parameters of your images and of your movies, because what this program will do is, and when you start it, it will begin taking images and it will save them as fast as it can, depending on your exposure, into an AVI movie, which you then can process later. And what's nice is it will save all of the information, your date, your time, your target, your color, anything you want, into a log file. So it saves a lot of time. You don't have to take these down as notes. It saves it into a text file and you can look it up later. It shows you your frames per second, how many frames you captured. It shows you a histogram of your image, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And obviously this is an example of when I was imaging the moon. So this is Fire Capture, which is available for free. Then the next step is to pre-align if necessary. Sometime if your seeing is very bad, or perhaps your tracking is not that great, or like with the 110-plus-year-old weight-driven drive, the planet might be drifting around in your view a little bit. That's not good when you're doing your later processing. So this planetary image preprocessor, which is also free, what it does is it doesn't modify the image of the planet. It simply will load in your movie file, align all the image, and then resave it as a new movie file, so your planet's not moving around a lot, which could cause some confusion in your later processing. And so your input is a video with the planet moving around, and your output is a video where the images are aligned. So the next step is to actually do the selection and averaging. I use AutoStacker, which is also free. And there's a good community. You can ask questions if you have any, if you have any problems, if you're just getting started. So what you do is you open your movie file, and then you analyze it, and the analysis produces this chart. By the way, can people hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can hear you.
Yeah, you're starting to pile up a few questions too. So,
You want to take some questions
Sure,
now
yes.
or wait?
No, we can go
Actually-
now. We can go now.
There was, might have to backtrack a couple of slides. Kim was asking about the small telescope on top of the 6-inch. Was that a guide scope?
That was just a guide scope or a finder.
Just okay.
It's a finder scope.
And Chandrasekhar Nori asked, from an earlier talk on our channel, we understood that color camera is as good as monochrome when filters for planetary imaging. So I guess what the question is, what's your opinion about using a color camera for imaging Jupiter or using a monochrome with filters?
Basically, as with everything, it depends. First of all, if you're using, and again, we'll get into this shortly, but this particular telescope, the 6-inch Warner and Swasey on Mount Wilson, it has a lot of chromatic aberration. Also, many modern refractors have chromatic aberration. I use a 4-inch refractor f9, and it has chromatic aberration. So if you're using a telescope like this, you basically have to use color filters, because each color focuses at a different distance from the lens. And if you don't, you'll get artifacts, color artifacts in your image. So you basically have to use color filters with a monochrome camera when you use this telescope, for example, or any other telescope with any appreciable amount of chromatic aberration. Or if you're using a Schupmann telescope or a Newtonian, for example, which does not have chromatic aberration, you can use a color camera. And it also depends on what your end goal is. If your goal is to make a pretty picture, you can use a color camera. If you're trying to do some science, in general, most science requires monochrome, even if you don't have a image with chromatic aberration. So it really depends on the situation, what your equipment is, and what your goal is.
And Lubo brought up the fact if you're imaging on Jupiter, of course, it's rotating at a pretty good speed. So that's a consideration as well.
Yes, that in auto fire capture here, when you're taking your images, which become movies, which is simply a stack of subsequent images, you can't just keep integrating and integrating and integrating. Yes, because Jupiter is rotating, and this lucky imaging technique only works on static targets. So the process depends on the fact that the target doesn't change. So there is a limit to how long you can take images in a single movie. We'll actually get into that a little bit shortly. But yes, you have to take that into account when you're taking your initial data.
I think that's it for now.
Okay. Okay, so we're back into our auto stacker. So we've opened our image, we've analyzed it, and the output is this chart. In this particular movie, there was 4,976 images of Saturn. So the x-axis on this chart is simply the images from 0 to 4,975 here on the right, 0 on the left. The y-axis is the quality of the image, which is basically the contrast. There are actually two plots here. The gray plot is when the data is plotted image sequentially, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., all the way to 4, 9, 7, 5. The green plot is the same data, just plotted from best here on the left to worst here on the right. So after you have this quality graph, you have to decide up here how many of these total images do you want to keep. My opinion is just the way I do it is I tend to select the number of images I want, 2 to the n. So it's I do 256, 512, 1024, 2048, etc. That's just the way I do it. There's no particular rule, or you can select percentage if you want to use half, quarter, whatever you'd like. This does take some practice. You also have to set your alignment boxes. You can either draw them manually. If you click manual draw, you can draw them manually, or you can have the computer draw them automatically. You set the size of your box, place the grid, and it will automatically place this grid. And these are the points that it will use to align all of the images you would like to keep, in my case, 1024. You then hit stack, and it will take the best 1024 and align them and average them. So your output is a single image, is an average of all those images. And this does take some practice and get used to what works for your situation. The next step is to do the wavelet processing. I use Registax, and this is also free. And the idea here is to enhance your image. So these layers, which you then can select the amount of denoising you'd like to apply, the amount of sharpening, and then this slider also increases or decreases the amount of the effect. And the layers depend on the size of the details you want to work on, where layer 1 works on the small details and layer 6 works on the large details. And in some ways, this is kind of an embarrassment of riches. There are so many possibilities. You can spend hours and days and weeks finding the best one. So this also takes some practice to find out what works best for your image. So you basically select what you want, you apply, and this is your result. So we've gone from that blurry image of Saturn. We've taken a bunch of images in our video. We've aligned and stacked and selected the best ones. We've wavelet processed them, and this is the result. Now comes to the fact that, for example, Jupiter, which is the most egregious case, that the fact that it's rotating and that the lucky imaging process depends on a static target. So we can compensate with that on the planets. So we use this program called WinJupos, which is also free. And what it will do is it will take your images of Jupiter, and in the name of the files is the date and the time that the images were taken. So the program can then rotate the images so that they all will line up on the same longitudinal axis, so that when you average them, you don't smear the images. So your input is our sequential images of Jupiter, and your output is a single image that is the average of those. But the details have not been blurred because the program has derotated Jupiter. And this is an example where we've taken these 4 images of Jupiter, which are sequential, and they're relatively close in time. They're perhaps a minute or at most 2 minutes apart each. And WinJupos has derotated them so they all have the same longitude. And when they're averaged, the fine details don't smear. And the result is the final image on the right. So that's how we take care of the rotation. And we can also do this for Mars and Saturn. Okay, so that is the quick survey of the lucky imaging technique. Are there any questions on that?
I have a question. You're probably going to talk about this more when you present again. But what do you end up taking? 10%, 25%? I mean, as an average of your total frames?
It really depends on the seeing that day. The better the seeing, the more you're able to keep. On good seeing nights, for example, especially at Mount Wilson, you can keep on the order of half. If it's really bad seeing, you'll keep 10%. You want to keep as many as you can, because the more you average, the you'll beat down your noise. But it becomes it's a trade-off, as everything is. The more you average, you beat down your noise, which is good, but you're also averaging more and more poor images. So you have to make that trade-off. So what I tend to do is, when I first start processing a night's image, I don't just put one number here. I'll put say 256, 512, 1024, 2048. I'll come up with 4 images, and then I process them all the same in Registax, and then I'll pick the best one, and then do the rest of the night with those settings.
So does the same rule apply for something like the moon, where you have all the light in the world and your noise is really quite low?
The answer is yes, but you never have all the light in the world. You always want more light, because this technique is also dependent on very fast exposures, and the faster the better, because you're essentially taking a picture of a moving target because of the seeing. So it's always in astronomy, no matter what you do, even when you're looking at the sun, you always want more light. So yes, the moon is of course brighter than Saturn, but you always wish you had more light. But the technique is the same, and the selection of these parameters is you use the same thought process.
I don't see any more questions on YouTube. In the room?
Tom,
Yes.
hang on for a minute. I'm on. Tom, Lupo in particular wants to hear a little bit about the layer preview in Registax. Do you use that?
No, only thing I do with Registax is the wavelet processing.
Okay.
Here.
Okay. Oh wow. Well, okay. And
Yeah, there are. This isn't the only program that does this. You know, as with everything, there's more than one way to do the same thing and get the same result or similar result. This is just how I happen to do it.
okay. I do not understand when WinJupos is used. If you've just used Registax, do you then use WinJupos, or do you get 4 complete independent pictures of Jupiter, and then going through the whole of that initial process, and then take your 4 pictures and use WinJupos to make 1 picture?
I showed this in the order that I proceed.
Okay.
With the data. So WinJupos is used last. So if you want, you can stop with any one of these 4 images of Jupiter.
Okay.
However, the background noise is reduced by the square root of the number of, or 1 over the square root of the number of averages. So if you average 4 images, your background noise is reduced by half.
Okay.
That's why I tend to do things 2 to the n.
So WinJupos is not using the frames from the AVI to derotate. It's taking the whole stack as it's finished processing and rotating back to another whole stack finished processing. And which is the way you presented it.
Yes, the answer to your simple question is yes. I have shown it in the order I do the steps. However, WinJupos is very powerful, and it can, depending on how you have it set up, actually derotate the images in the original AVI file. I have not gotten that to work yet, and there are certain you have to have it set up in a certain way, and there are certain limitations. So you can do an even better job, because, for example, in any one of these 4 images, Jupiter has rotated a little bit. So it could be perhaps be better, but you're getting to the point where is the improvement enough? Is the improvement worth the effort? Because you also have to keep in mind that this even in the best seeing, the seeing is not perfect. So there is going to be degradation. So there's a chance that the improvement is below is so small that you can't see it. So then what's the point of doing it? So there are times when you can try to make some improvements, and you put both images, comparison images, on the screen, and it takes you a minute to decide which one is better. Well, is it really worth it? If they're that close, why go through the extra effort? Yeah. So the answer is WinJupos can do that. It's not clear to me whether it's worth it yet.
And Isaac just put down another question. In the Mansion mirror correct for spherical aberration?
Yes, there is no spherical aberration within about, I believe it's about 20 or 25 arc minutes is the high quality field of view of the Schupmann telescope, or at least it's so small that it doesn't degrade the image.
Okay. Anything more, Alex?
One of the disadvantages, which I said at the beginning, is it's not a wide field, rich field type telescope. It's meant for planets and the moon and like globular clusters. It's not a light bucket, and it does give, for example, on the Orion Nebula, even though you can only look at somewhat of a small piece of it, it gives spectacular images of the filaments. I've never seen, even without a filter, you can see tremendous filaments in the Orion Nebula because the image is so high contrast. But one of the penalties is it is a small field of view.
In a typical image, Isaac wants to know, how bad is the image near the edges and still in the Schupmann?
If I put the ZWO 1600, which has the big chip, which I believe gives about a 20 or 25 arc minute in the small dimension, the stars are still pretty good, but that's about as big a field as you can go before the stars start to degrade. So it's on the order of 20 arc minutes diameter when you have the high quality field of view.
Okay. Thank you. And I think we're finished with the questions as they sit right now. We encourage you always, everybody, to put in more questions as we go.
Okay, so now we're going to get to some of the results. So this is from the Stellafane Schupmann. This is of Mars back in 2020. In this particular case, we used red, green, and blue filters because we also wanted to use an infrared filter. So we had a monochrome camera with a filter set red, green, blue, infrared. So the color pictures are assemblages of the red, green, and blue, where we took a 60-second red, video 30-second green and blue. And then IR was 2 minutes. And we also have the issue, of course, that Mars is rotating, which can be seen in this image set over less than an hour. Mars is rotating from lower right to upper left. But we still get some pretty good images in this. And it was not so good seeing that night. So you see that we operated the instrument at 9-inch f/26 as opposed to 13. But we still have some pretty good features there.
I'm sorry, Tom, to interrupt, but how do you map the infrared?
We put an infrared filter, and the ZWO, the silicon-based chips, are detect out to about 1 micron. So we have from
My
1
question
micron.
is, if you got an infrared image of some sort, how did you map it on your
Probably
RGB
luminance,
palette?
right?
I guess
What-
I don't completely
What color
understand.
did you assign the infrared?
Just monochrome, black and white.
It's a probably a luminance channel, right?
Yeah, it's just luminance channel. So the lower images, the monochrome images, are infrared. The filter was 850. The filter cut off at 850, and silicon ends at about 1 micron. The lower monochrome images. Does that answer the question?
We can chat about it later.
Okay.
He's only the bottom row is just IR, and the
Yes.
top row is just RGB, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And then this is an image of Mars with a color camera from this past apparition in November. And also the seeing wasn't that good that night, so we were operating at 9 inches. But this is a color camera. So this is just, we did not have to assemble red, green, and blue like previous. And we still have some pretty nice fine details, keeping in mind Mars is a pretty small target. And this is Jupiter from this past year in September. It's a series. This was also with a color camera. So this is just a single shot color camera. We take the red, green, and blue all at one time. And it was very good seeing that night. For some reason, we had a very, this summer and early fall, we had a unusual number of very good seeing nights in Vermont, which is very rare. So we were operating at 13 inches. And our image scale is 0.1 arc seconds per pixel. And we choose this because we wanted 4 pixels per airy disk. That's a whole other talk, how to decide that number. But we did get some pretty good images, details here. And then on September 10th this year, we had one particular night where we had very thick smoke and haze from fires out west. So the sky was very dim, but we put in a red filter and we got these spectacular images. So again, we're operating at full 13-inch. And we got these are pretty spectacular images, very high detail. And this is with a monochrome camera. And then these are some movies from the equivalent days. The previous image, there were many more images than were shown other than those 5. So these are just these images strung together.
That's really cool.
About 3 hours from the first image, from first movie to the last.
About yes. But there's a lot of subtle detail up here in the north and south that is seen, and there's quite a few little cloud details and such. Quite a lot of detail. And this is a picture of Jupiter and Saturn on the night of September 3rd. Again, very good seeing. We operated at 13-inch color camera. That's a pretty good Saturn. Saturn's still very low in the horizon. And this is Jupiter and Saturn from last year, and then a movie from that same night.
Awesome.
This is some data from Mount Wilson. This is a set of Mars from 2018. Again, that 6-inch Warner and Swasey refractor does pose some challenges, which I'll get to shortly. This is a series of Mars. This is assembled from separate red, green, and blue images from a monochrome camera.
Is that when we had that dust storm?
Yes,
Mars?
I believe. Yeah, I believe there was a dust storm, that apparition. Yes.
Yeah, it looks a little more washed out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then this is Jupiter and Saturn from that same time frame. Again, this is a 6-inch, so we have to keep in mind that the nature of the instrument has only about half the resolution, even under the best of circumstances, as the Schupmann. But we also have to keep in mind that we look here, the filters we had to use, we used a normal red and green wide band, but we had to use a very narrow blue filter. And that's because I mentioned before that lens has an unusual design in that the blue itself, unlike this picture, the blue itself is spread out so much that if you use a normal 100 nanometer band blue filter, you still can't get a good focus. So we had to use a very narrow band blue filter. The penalty for that is we're cutting down so much light that we have to increase our exposure, and we're now breaking that rule for lucky imaging of taking a quick exposure. So for this image of Saturn, the blue images were half a second, which is tremendously long. And it's amazing. It's a testament to the good seeing at Mount Wilson that even with half-second blue images, the image is as good as this is. And that's basically why it has this blue tinge, because the blue images are so long. But that's still a pretty decent image for given the circumstances. And this is a set of some Jupiter images made with a 16-inch Meade, also up at Mount Wilson, on 3 different nights. And the seeing on these particular nights were pretty good. And this is Saturn with a 16-inch Meade. Again, Saturn, even when you don't have that problem with the blue, Saturn is on the dim side. It's much dimmer than Jupiter, so our images have to be longer, and that gives the atmosphere a chance to make things a little blurry. This is a sample of Jupiter from with 3 different telescopes from Mount Wilson in 2019. Here on the right is with the 6-inch Warner and Swasey, in the center the 16-inch Meade, and on the right is the 60-inch. And this is perhaps an example of the fact where a smaller telescope can get better images than a larger one, even though it's not exactly apples to apples because it was different nights. But in my opinion, the 16-inch version is the best. It could have been perhaps that the seeing was not as good on the night we used the 60, or it could just be the fact that the smaller telescope can resolve better details under non-ideal conditions. And I blew these up so they're all the same size on the screen, kind of for a somewhat apples to apples comparison. because there are many less pixels across Jupiter on the 6-inch version than on the 60. So now we'll talk about the moon and high dynamic range imaging. So everything we talked about, lucky imaging, it all applies to the moon. However, when you're setting up your exposure, whether it's for a planet or the moon, we get this histogram. The histogram, we have to keep in mind that in a computer, a picture is simply a grid of numbers. And what this histogram shows us is, in this particular case, it's an 8-bit image. So all of the numbers are from 0 to 255. So the x-axis over here on the left is 0, and over here on the right is 255, where 0 represents black and 255 represents white. The y-axis is the number of pixels in the picture at any particular number. So the reason there's a spike here on the left is because there's a lot of black in this image. The reason that this tail ends here is because the normal rule of thumb is you set your exposure time such that the brightest images, the brightest pixels, are in this area of the histogram. If these pixels go too far to the right, they saturate, and then you don't have any information. So this is a normal histogram. The problem is we're doing a good exposure on our bright areas, but we have less of exposure on our dim areas, and on the darker areas we have even less. So the idea of a high dynamic range picture is you take multiple exposures, some for the dark, some for the middle, and some for the dim areas. So you see that this area here on the right image is overblown. That's because we set the exposure for the dark areas. And then you use another program to combine these into a final image. And this is the result. So we basically have good exposures for the bright, the middle, and the dark areas. This was taken with the Schupmann telescope. I believe the seeing was very poor. I used a deep red filter with very fast exposure. And even though the seeing was very poor, we got a pretty good image. So this image is 7,500 pixels across. So we could print this 3 feet across and it would still look pretty good. So seeing it on a computer screen doesn't really give you the full view of it. But this is the advantage of high dynamic range imaging. And in my next talk in a month, I will go into much greater detail on how to do this on the moon. And I use Photomatic Essentials. And I also use Photoshop Elements, which costs on the order of $50 to $70. And this Photomatic Essential costs also about $50 to $70. However, for as much as I use it and for as powerful and easy to use as it is, I think it's worth it. These are some high-resolution images of the moon from Mount Wilson. We have Straight Wall on the left and Theophilus region on the right.
Those are awesome.
And this is with the 6-inch 6-inch Warner and Swasey. And this is with a red filter only, monochrome with a red filter.
Yeah.
Stoffler and Cassini regions. And then this is an example of the whole moon, and this is a comparison. On the left is the quote single correct exposure with the histogram that we see there, and then the image on the right is the equivalent high dynamic range image. And in this particular, once we're here on this part of the process, this is all definitely a matter of art. So there's really no right or wrong answer. You just you can tune these, you can tune how these images look to your particular taste. And this is an image of the full moon we took with the Mount Wilson 6-inch refractor with a red filter. Again, with this image can be printed 2-3 feet across. It would look great. And I didn't do anything to this Plato region. I just cropped it and blew it up, and we can see all the detail we get on the floor of Plato. And that is a telltale sign of very good seeing. And this is with a 6-inch telescope. So we're really pushing the limits of what that telescope can do with this particular image. I also, from Jersey, I use a 4-inch f9 refractor on the moon. And again, normally I set up an image with the normal exposure, single exposure on the left, and then the high dynamic range on the right. So this is just past first quarter. This is just before last quarter. This is just a little comparison I made of, this is a cut and paste. This wasn't an actual occultation, but I just pasted Jupiter next to the moon just to give a example of how small Jupiter and the planets are, which makes getting the details so difficult, because we have to use such high magnifications, and the penalty, of course, is we have dim light and we're blurring the atmosphere. But just even Jupiter is so small compared to the moon. And this is an example of Jupiter from the 4-inch f9 refractor operating at about f20. And again, they're somewhat low resolution because it's only a 4-inch telescope, and I had to use the red, green, and blue filters separately with a monochrome camera and then assemble them later because of the chromatic aberration. And Jupiter and Saturn with the same telescope. In my opinion, it's somewhat not worth doing with a 4-inch telescope, these planets, because you really don't get the detail. This is Jupiter in not only red, green, blue, but IR and methane. And if you want to get into science, you can start using some of these fancy filters. And this is a movie of Jupiter. Again, 4-inch refractor operating at f22. And this is an example of high dynamic range, how powerful it is. The image on the right is the image from Mount Wilson, and it's not a fair comparison, but this image on the left, I found a video on the internet that someone took of the moon with an iPhone, and then I processed it myself. And again, it's not a fair comparison because the resolution is certainly not there, but it's still not a halfway bad image just from a small telescope with an iPhone. So with this lucky imaging technique and the high dynamic range, you can really do a lot. And then our final picture, the high dynamic range isn't only good on the sky. This is a picture of Stellafane, the standard exposure on the right. And I ran it through the high dynamic range process, and it really brings out the full colors. So that's the last frame. Thanks for listening, and if anybody has any questions.
Well, we had a question a while back. When you said that using an 8-bit camera, Isaac asks, what about using a camera that has a higher bit depth? What are your thoughts about that?
You can, of course. Again, the question becomes: is there any practical benefit or a benefit that you could end up seeing? The ZWO cameras, they can run at 12-bit. One problem is, though, you have to download now, where you were downloading 1 byte before, you're now downloading 2 bytes. So you're getting a resultant drop in frame rate. So you're now getting half the pictures, but you're wasting 4 bits because you're going from 8 bits to 12, but you've got to download 16. And those from 13, 14, 15, and 16 are kind of wasted. So you're getting a lot less data in the same amount of time. And considering how good this image looks, for example, I don't know that it's worth it, because there are times when I've done 2 different procedures and I'm trying to decide which settings to use, and you put them on the screen at the same time, and it takes you a minute to find the difference. It's not worth, the difference isn't worth it. If it takes that long to find it, it's the image. The point is, you can do it. I don't know that there's a benefit, and there are penalties.
Isaac also asks, how does the Mangini mirror correct for both chromatic aberration and atmospheric refraction? I think you covered that earlier.
Yeah, well, the answer is it doesn't know the difference. Just one second. It doesn't. The color coming, this mangan, you have to kind of think of it's a pair. These kind of work together. This mangan will correct the color coming off of this this field mirror. The mangan doesn't care. I mean, within a certain limit, of course. Doesn't care where the color came from. Did it come from the lens or the atmosphere? It doesn't know, but it also doesn't care. The combination of this mangan corrector and the field lens working together will fix it. I mean, if you really want to get into the math and such, we'd have to get into the book. And I don't know all of that off the top of my head. But the point is, the mangan doesn't care where the color comes from within a certain range.
Well, there's more chatter going on about this subject, but that appears to be the questions that are remaining. Alex, did I miss any?
No, I think you got it. Yeah, everybody. We do tend to visit a lot. I mean, we are a club kind of. So yeah, sounds like a good job, Tom. I think a lot of people got a lot out of this, and I think a lot of people will be making plans to see you. When is that? The week after was April 23rd, or what is it out there? I suppose I can look at the calendar here. Yeah, April 23rd, you're going to be back. So
yes,
and you're going to go into details about how you process stuff and
how I do the moon. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Then I think we're about to wrap up for the evening. We kept our audience pretty well through the whole show, so that's good. So you guys come on back next week, and we'll hear Jim tell us about filters and stuff. And so that's what we're going to be doing. And Patrick is in charge. So Patrick, you can take us out, please, as you see fit. The show's time to wave good night. Good night, everybody. Good night. Good luck with your imaging.